Okay, thank you. So our next session this afternoon is on the vexed question, which we've already had a bit of interesting discussion and debate, I suppose, about over the last 24 hours on higher education affordability now and in the future. And I'm delighted that we have such a distinguished panel to speak on the issue. Each panellist will speak briefly, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And may I welcome our first speaker, who is Stuart Schmill, Dean of Admissions at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which has a 152-year tradition of the highest standards in science, engineering, technological education and research. And this year, thanks to Stu's support, the Sutton Trust brought 50 of our US summer school students to MIT, and Ali Hexley from our first cohort of 64 US summer schools is already studying with you, I believe. In fact, I gather that you're going to be visiting her Birmingham school this week. So one reason we're able to run the US summer schools is the great financial aid that universities like MIT offer to low and middle income students from home and abroad. And I hope you're going to tell us a bit about that now. Stuart, thank you.
Thank you, Conor, and thank you, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to come here. So far has been a really engaging morning, and the conversations have been great. Okay. It's always good when the guy from MIT can get the technology to work. It doesn't always happen that way. So access and affordability, what I intend to talk about is to give you a little bit of a US context, talk about MIT, and I'm going to comment a little bit on what some of the barriers are for students, particularly in the way we fund, or the way we fund students, and give you a little window into the future, because there is, the future is part of the title here, and the future is always very dangerous to try to talk about, but I will do that. So access and affordability is something that is very important, and in fact, I think the single thing that motivates my staff, our admissions office staff, is increasing access and affordability. It's what we put the largest bulk of our time on, focusing on. There's an entire system that needs to play into this, as we've talked about so far even today, that starts with building a pipeline all the way through our admissions and financial aid policies and ensuring that the students that we bring onto our campus succeed. But all of those require money. And as I was thinking about, well, what's really the single thing that makes all of this work, and for us at MIT, I think we've had some successes at it. The single thing that I can boil this down to is what is required for anyone to ever spend money, and that is commitment. And I believe on our campus we're deeply committed to this notion of expanding access and making our education affordable for students. So I want to talk about that. And first, let me give a little bit of background, the U.S. context. We see funding for our education, again, as a system, with many players that have responsibility for this. So the government certainly plays a very big role in funding higher education, both our federal government and our state governments. So the federal governments offer direct grants to students to carry with them wherever they study. And that's the bulk of the aid that the federal government offers is through those grant programs. The Pell Grant is the largest of those for low-income families. They also offer tax credits for families with children who are studying in higher education, and loan programs, subsidized loan programs, that includes now an income-based repayment scheme that, in fact, too few of our students are taking advantage of, even though it exists. But students have to sign up for it. It's not automatic. So that's the majority of the way the federal government supports higher education. Our state governments support it in a couple of ways, the largest being the appropriations for running the large state university programs in all 50 states. States also offer direct grants to students that are can be both based on need, so means tested, but also based on merit. And this notion of grants and bursaries being offered to students not based on need, but based on merit is it's one that's been growing and controversially so in the U.S., offering bursaries to families that don't need it in order to attract the high talent students. So that's the way our government supports higher education. There are private sources, companies and nonprofits that will support and fund students. It's not a particularly large part of the way higher ed gets funded, but it does exist. Institutional support is also very big. And in fact, for MIT, the institutional support plays by far the largest role in supporting students studying at MIT. And then finally, students and families, we do expect them to pay for their education. And as has been talked about earlier, the benefits that accrue to students are quite large, and we think it's appropriate for students to have some skin in the game and to actually pay for what is valuable to them. All right, so I want to talk now about what the barriers are, the biggest barriers. I'm going to highlight 3 of them: complexity, government spending, and cost. So first of all, complexity. I think has been mentioned here already, the way funding works is complex. So what it costs to educate students is different from what we charge, which is different from what students pay. So that, I don't know very many other industries where that is true. And so we've talked about sticker price. So this chart is what gets trotted out very often. The fact that over the last 30 years, the sticker price, or what colleges charge for tuition, has increased 2.5 to 3-fold over inflation over the last 30 years. It's very high increase, very big increases. And that is true, and that's what is in the public's minds, is that tuition prices are running out of control, when the reality is that the net price of what students actually pay, so the tuition less the grants, scholarships, bursaries that students get, has been flat over the last 20 years. But I think the reason we call it sticker price is because it is sticky in people's minds. And that's really the challenge for us. So Rebecca Westphal earlier mentioned some research done from Professors Carolyn Hawksby at Stanford, Chris Avery, who's at Harvard, and Sarah Turner, who's at the University of Virginia. They've done some research on finding these high-achieving, low-income students who are not making applications to highly selective schools. They've found tens of thousands of these students, and this complexity seems to be the biggest reason why they're not making those applications. They just don't understand the accessibility. And they have tried interventions that have actually worked, and they've been able to move the dial a little bit. And Rebecca mentioned an effort on her campus where they're going to try to take that research and move the dial a little bit more. And it relates to information flow. All right, second barrier, government spending, particularly in the states. So the federal government has actually maintained level funding or increased their funding a little bit for students, but the states has really decreased funding, and this has hurt the large state university systems, particularly the flagships, the highly selective flagships in each of the 50 states. And you can see that the portion of the state budgets has decreased dramatically over the course of the last 20 years. And this has caused states to go recruiting outside their borders to bring in higher tuition paying students from other states and overseas as well. And this has particularly been exacerbated by the fact that mean and median incomes in the US and elsewhere over the last decade have been declining. So this decreased funding just gets exacerbated. And of course, what that leads to is increase in the student loans that students need to take up in order to pay for their own education. Okay, so the third barrier is cost. And this is one that we haven't yet really talked about, but I think we're going to spend a little bit more time here on, is one of the reasons why why it's important for us to make sure that students, low-income, middle-income students, attend selective schools is because these schools spend more money per student. And earlier we heard about the research that shows the benefits that accrue to students. Universities are, the biggest expense is labor and high-value labor, and labor that has not been able to benefit from technological gains in recent times, perhaps until now. And it's something that maybe we'll talk about in a short bit. But this is why the cost, not so much to families, but what it costs universities to educate students has been increasing over time. All right, so let me give you a little bit of context here and background about MIT. First of all, and the commitment that we made. I like this, yes. The commitment that we have made to our students. All right. So, as has been mentioned earlier, we also are, in our admissions policies, we are need blind and we practice contextual admissions. All of the aid that we give out to our students is based on need, so means tested, all based on need, on sliding scales, and we meet the full need of every student. And this is true for US students, it's true for international students as well, and I believe we're one of only 6 universities in the United States for which that is true, that we can hold these policies for all of our students. I think this contextual-based admissions and recruitment is very important to allow these policies for us to enroll students that are socioeconomically diverse. So let me show you some of the numbers that we've been able to achieve. First of all, our tuition, again, a very high tuition, but only about 1/3 of our students pay that tuition. And almost 2/3 of our students receive a means-tested, a needs-based grant or bursary. And for those that receive aid, the average tuition is less than $10,000. So that's about 2/3, a little less than 2/3 of our entire student body. And again, we are using a high tuition and a high financial aid model because those who do not receive the grants and can pay the high aid do, and that helps fund those who are receiving the grants. I should also point out that those that are receiving this aid, the financial aid, the scholarships, and the bursaries that we give out, more than 80% of those have come from former students directly. Fundraising and our endowment that's largely made up from our alumni who have given to very specific scholarship accounts so that the monies that they give, that they donate to us, is earmarked to benefit current student scholarships. So that's the model that we use. So for families that earn $75,000 US or less, we make sure that they have enough scholarship money so that their tuition is zero. And again, it's a sliding scale. So those who earn less will be given even more bursary over the tuition to pay for room and board. And that's 1/3 of our entire student body for whom tuition is zero. And we give out $87 million last year. And again, more than 80% of that comes from former students. So less than half of our students leave with debt, and we've had a lot of conversations on our campus as to what is the appropriate amount of student aid, student debt that students should have. So the average debt is almost $18,000 in total over the 4 years, which we think is entirely manageable and appropriate for students who are coming out and on average earning about $67,000. So our aid policies really are designed to move the needles up and down on these, how much students take out in loan, how much they work for while they're on campus, and so forth. Okay, last couple of slides here, because I did have to talk a moment about the future. So right now on our campus, there's a task force that's been set up to look at the future of higher education and an MIT education in particular, and how we might change things, with a particular eye towards thinking about the fact that our costs have been rising every year for the reasons that we talked about, labor being the biggest cost. And one of the key themes is thinking about how can we finance our education differently to bring down the cost. Of course, one of the more promising lines of thinking about how to do this is using online education, MOOCs. I think Michael may talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But MIT-X, which with collaboration with Harvard and some others became edX, which is an online education, which we intend to take some use of. And it's not entirely clear how it's going to change our education, but our hope is that it can bring our costs down so that we can educate more students at the same quality or better. I mean, that's our goal. So the last thing I want to leave you with is about 5 years ago, right as the global economic crisis hit, MIT commissioned another task force. Seems like we're commissioning task forces a lot, and maybe we are. But a task force, this one in 2008, was designed to respond to the economic downturn and the fact that our endowment lost value. We needed to cut money out of our budget, basically, was really, and how can we do that without losing quality? So there were 6 principles that were outlined at the beginning in the charge to this task force. And 2 of these 6 outlined the one single line item in the budget that was considered untouchable. The only one, and it was not faculty salaries, but it was our commitment to maintaining need-blind admissions, meeting the full need of every student, and maintaining or increasing the diversity of our student body. Both of those have to go together. It was the single line item that was held sacrosanct as we were cutting our budgets. So when I was thinking about, again, what is the key takeaway here? It really comes down to making a commitment to doing this. And so with that, I will pause and turn it over.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Well, our second panelist and I go back a long way to the days when we were crafting labour education policy together and implementing it in government in the 1990s. Those were the days. Professor Sir Michael Barber has huge experience working in education since his days in government, working for McKinsey and now as Chief Education Advisor to Pearson, helping sort out school systems from New York to Karachi. In his spare time, he's been a member of the Brown Committee that recommended many of the recent changes to university fees and loans in the UK, and has written an influential IPPR pamphlet on MOOCs, which could, of course, disrupt all our thinking on access and affordability, and is his theme today. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Conor. I'm not going to use the PowerPoint, but that is the title of the pamphlet that Conor just mentioned, and MOOCs are mentioned, but it's actually a much bigger argument about the potential transformation of universities in the next 5 to 10 years, and there are copies outside if you want to take it away. I'm just going to pick out a few details in the 5 minutes or so I've got with you, and then obviously you can ask any questions you want. But what an avalanche is coming, it says in the opening phase is there are a lot of challenges facing university systems. I'm talking globally here. One is rising costs, which we've just heard mentioned. The second is, although clearly a degree is an asset in the labour market, it's very variable according to which place you go and what you study. In some cases, it's barely an asset, particularly given the rising cost. Thirdly, it says employability is a key issue for the younger generation, and a lot of universities aren't paying enough attention to that. And fourthly, it says there's growing competition, not just globally among universities, but to various functions of a university from an entirely new crowd of players in the market. The canals in England weren't killed off economically by competition among canals. It was the invention of the railways that did for them. And there are a whole lot of new players doing some of the things that universities do that will come in, and that we call the unbundling of the university, which opens up new possibilities for new combinations and new ways of learning, but is a threat if you stand in the way of the avalanche. So what we're predicting in there, and we intentionally push the analysis pretty hard, probably beyond where we can be confident of in order to provoke debate, is there is a big change coming to universities, and in the debates I've had around the world since we published that, I think that's what growing numbers of university leaders around the world think too. What's really hard and comes through in all the conversations I have is it's very hard to predict exactly how, for example, the MOOCs are going to completely, the impact they're going to have, what kinds of outcomes there'll be. But anyway, that's what that's about. This panel is about funding and access and all of that. And I just want to pick up 3 lessons from the work that I've done around the world that Conor mentioned, and then kind of 3 implications for the future. And then please feel free to ask anything. The first lesson is getting, I think this has come through both in Les's presentation and what we've just heard from Stuart, which is that you have to think about access and success together. So thinking about access to university without thinking about success in terms of completion from university is a mistake. You've got to see the whole life cycle. So I'm really glad to see the British government and Les in particular thinking about access and success together. I think that's a big step forward. And then within that, you've got to think about 3 aspects of that from the student perspective, each of which is important. And very often, they either don't get thought of sufficiently in combination, or just one of them gets picked out. You've got to think about financial support to the student. You've got to think about academic support to the student. And you've got to think about social support to the student. And those 3 things together are all key aspects of both access and especially success and avoiding dropout rates. I spent a good part of a 3-year period working with some large public universities in the United States exactly on this access and success issues, and getting them to think about each of those angles on the triangle is really important. Second lesson, I mentioned it already, employability is crucial, because when students are thinking about access and then progress through university, they're thinking about what value that's going to give them in the labour market. I'm not arguing that that's the only value of a university education. I don't want to be accused of that, but I am arguing that if you're either paying now or racking up some debt for the future, your employment prospects are a key part of the calculation that you're making all the time. And I think universities have a way to go in getting that right. The place that's impressed me most on this is Exeter. You can't walk through the Exeter University campus without passing the very beautiful, very effective employability centre, which does volunteering, careers advice. They send you a calendar before you even start, saying, of course, you're going to get a good degree, but check in with us on at least these 6 occasions during your 3 years, because don't think that getting a good degree will be enough to guarantee employability in future. That's the kind of thinking that's needed university by university across this country and elsewhere. Third key lesson is there are some very practical things that seem to matter to transitioning from access to success for what in the US get called students who get called underrepresented minorities. So some work we did in the big public sector universities that I was mentioning a few minutes ago, where dropout rates are often 50% over a 6-year graduation rate, so really much, very, very challenging figures. There are some lead indicators of whether somebody's likely to drop out. For example, we were able to show that whether somebody, a new student, went to the library, got trained to use the library in the first month was a very strong indicator of whether they would eventually drop out. That is something that a university can fix. Similarly, lots of universities, and particularly the academic staff as opposed to the admissions staff, were saying to students who came from underrepresented minorities, I know you didn't have a great high school education, don't worry about how many credits you accumulate in year 1, just get the remedial stuff done. Totally wrong. that what works is getting the students up to speed as fast as possible and saying to them, you need to get as many credits in year one or in semester one as anybody else. So it's going to be really hard work and we're right behind you. So getting those small things right, the lead indicators, and ploughing them into the university strategy is really important. And I think British universities have got a lot to learn from some of the best work there. So those are 3 lessons. Thinking about the future and looking ahead, I was struck by, and we'll see how it plays out, the brief speech or sort of White House message that the President did in August, talking about shifting the government funding regime to supporting universities in achieving outcomes for students, as opposed to what he called seat time, the amount of time you spend going through university. Exactly how that will play out, I don't think anybody's quite clear yet, but that represents a shift that you're seeing right across the education world to a focus on outcomes that I think will have big implications and is worth thinking about and watching how that plays out. In the UK, obviously there's going to be a debate in the next year or two up to the election about the fee cap. Let's assume for a minute there was some money to do anything for universities. The worst thing you could do with it would be to spend it reducing the fee cap. If you reduce the fee cap without any extra money, that's disaster. If you reduce it and spend a lot of government money, that's just a big waste of money. So the fee cap should probably be raised because inflation is occurring in costs. If you did have money for universities, there's a research argument which I won't go into today, but the second thing is thinking about the way MIT and Harvard quoted in the Sutton Trust research today and elsewhere, thinking about how you could get government capital money to building an endowment fund, either an endowment fund or a number of endowment funds that would get you towards, across a system, needs, plan and mission. That would be something that would really be a step in the right direction from the social mobility argument that the Sutton Trust has been making so effectively for the last decade. And then the final part I want to mention, which it does go back to MOOCs, but not only MOOCs, is I think governments around the world and universities around the world, regardless of whether the governments do it, need to think about big innovations. We heard it right at the end of the MIT presentation, where you can get much bigger scale, possibly higher quality, but certainly the same quality at much, much lower cost. The problem with the university rankings and a lot of the way we think about university is actually the price is an indicator of quality. So what you heard in the debates in university councils around this country at the time of the implementation of policy following the Brown Committee's review was universities debating whether they should charge the 9,000 fee maximum or have a lower price. Lots of them decided not to charge a lower price, not because it was to do with cost, but because if they were came in at 6,500, it would be seen as cheap and cheerful and not quality. So there was a reverse elasticity in play. But if you combine, as in many other sectors, great human capital with fantastic technology and new models of delivery, there's every reason to believe you could get higher quality, much bigger scale and much lower cost, which obviously would be really great for social mobility.
Thank you very much, Michael. And our third panellist, Dr. Sally Mapstone, is Pro-Vice-Chancellor at Oxford, where she has responsibility for overall university strategy for teaching, learning, student support, admissions and employability, which sounds like a busy job. The Sutton Trust has had a long and fruitful relationship with Oxford. It's where, as Peter mentioned this morning, we had our first summer school, and today we support programmes like our Pathways to Law programme and the separate Oxford Pathways programme there. And there has also, as we heard this morning, been some significant progress, certainly in the state school numbers going to Oxford since we started. So how is Oxford responding to the whole issue of higher education affordability, and what plans has it for the future? Over to you, Sally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to do PowerPoint either. Certain things go with speaking from an Oxford perspective, and one of them is quite regularly challenging myths or assumptions about the place. Some of those are to be expected. Some of them are rather less so. I imagine that some of you may have seen quite recently a report in the newspapers based on some research about Oxford that reported that names like Darcy, Percy and Mandeville are still overrepresented at Oxford, thus reinforcing a lack of social mobility. And I think it was the Daily Mail that, of course, took the opportunity to illustrate this with a photograph of Colin Firth in his white shirt. And we'll see what that does to our admissions numbers. But more seriously, I've taught at Oxford for 30 years, and I can tell you that none of my students has had any of those surnames. My current postgraduate students, I mostly teach postgraduates at the moment, my current postgraduate students, just to name a few of them, have the surnames Kelly, Murray and Leahy, which I think actually tells you something about my subject area. I work on Celtic and Scottish subjects, and probably just as little about social mobility. Now, the point I'm working round to here is that good data, evidence gathering and a willingness to question suppositions are really, I think, important aspects of how we can make progress in achieving fairness, mobility and quality in admissions at undergraduate and graduate level. Now, as we've been hearing, the past few years have seen some dramatic changes in the fees universities charge to UK and EU undergraduates and the way in which those students pay through them, largely through loans repayable past a £21,000 a year salary after graduation. I think it's important that we're still learning about the impact of those changes on patterns of application behaviour in our potential student community, and that the government and universities are still learning and to some extent experimenting with the best way of setting up student support provision in the face of these new arrangements. And I'm going to come back to that a bit later on, because we at Oxford would be the first to accept that we need to learn from these new arrangements, and that's going to take us some time. Now, I would also really agree that when we think about student access and student support, we should be thinking across the whole of a student career, from admission through to graduation and employability. And indeed, I would suggest that we should now be thinking of student careers also that can go on from undergraduate to graduate work, because graduate access is an increasingly important issue, and it was good to see that raised by Vince Cable this morning. I think I would also say that we're also very glad to see HEFGI's recent postgraduate student support initiative, pilot initiative. Within a couple of years, we're going to see the first cohort of students who paid the 9K fees graduating. And we all know, we've heard already, that financial provision for master's students in the UK is poor. And this is an area to which all universities do need to give focus. At Oxford, we're having great success with a graduate match fund scholarship programme in which the university matches external philanthropic funding on a 40-60 ratio to provide scholarships either on a spend-down basis or endowed scholarships for graduate students. And we've raised nearly £30 million of funding this way in the past 18 months. But there's a very long way to go to address our graduate funding needs this way. A viable PGT loan scheme is certainly something that, as we all know, needs discussion. But the delivery and possibly the financial model of student education could be changing in the future, and two of our speakers have already alluded to this, particularly the impact of the MOOCs phenomenon. There are those who argue that MOOCs have the potential to revolutionise not only the way in which teaching is delivered, but university financial models, and we've heard some of this in the remarks from Stuart and Michael. If there's a mass move to online provision and away from face-to-face delivery. The current state of MOOCs in the UK suggests that for most universities they're a supplement rather than a substitute, a form of teaching often aimed more at potential learners across the world rather than students in their own domain. Now, of course, students, including Oxford students, are already sampling MOOCs from many points of origin as they do the hunter-gathering work that goes with researching their subject. In Oxford, we don't see the advent of MOOCs as radically transforming our teaching or fees and funding models, and I'm not saying that in a from a perspective of kind of Luddite conservatism, and I'll explain why. I should say we do a tremendous amount of open educational resource work in Oxford. We've had about 21.5 million hits on our iTunes U site, so this is not about not wanting to support online education, but we think MOOCs are something rather different, and we don't see them as disrupting what we do, and that is because we intend to remain with the kind of teaching that makes Oxford so distinctive, and I think possibly in its own way so radical. Small group tutorials delivered in colleges or departments, supplemented by departmental lectures. And this comes down, I think, also to the whole cost question. If you're going to study the Canterbury Tales with me, what would you prefer? Would you like to have a 1-hour tutorial in my room, sitting on my sofa with 1 or 2 other people, where you've come to talk about this subject for an hour, you've worked on it all week, there's no hiding place, but you come out really having been challenged on what you're thinking about? Or would you rather be part of a group of 100 people or so, watching me lecture or a video of me lecturing with very little interaction on that subject, particularly if you were paying £9,000 a year for that experience? So we think that the personalised, individually calibrated education that Oxford provides in a collegiate environment is a brilliant way of teaching. But it's essential that the educational experience that we offer be available to all of those who are able enough to make the most of it, and that nobody's deterred from applying to Oxford because they don't think that they can afford it or that they wouldn't fit in, the Darcy syndrome. Now, like all universities who charge a fee over £6,000, we have an access agreement with the Office for Fair Access, and in that agreement, we've set ourselves specific targets for increasing over a 5-year period the proportions of students at Oxford who come from UK schools with little history of sending pupils to Oxford, and from UK backgrounds identified through postcode evidence as showing socio-economic disadvantage or of having little participation in higher education. We haven't actually gone for the state school target marker because we think, as John himself said earlier from Cambridge, that the state independent divide masks a lot of variation, and we've gone for something rather different, which is to look at types schools with particularly little history of sending students to Oxford. So access is a lot about what universities do to encourage applications from a diverse cohort and to support them when they're admitted. It's also, of course, about how that cohort perceives and experiences the university in advance of an application. And one of the things that we've learned in over 20 years of really serious access work at Oxford is that you need to target your access activities and you need to monitor and evaluate them in order to discern what actually works. And I'm just going to give you one brief example here, which is very relevant in this context, in that it's the one that we've really found to be the most successful. And here we're building very much on work that we began in the first instance with the support of the Sutton Trust. So what I'm talking about here are what we call Oxford's unique summer schools. They're now in their 5th year of existence. They run over 5 weeks in July and August. The numbers of attending them each year have increased every year, and in 2014 we're going to be bringing 1,000 school pupils to Oxford. They come from state schools. They're selected on the basis of their academic merit within the context of the schools in which that was achieved. They live in colleges for a week. They have the full Oxford academic experience, so they have tutorials, they go to lectures, they do lab work, they have full access to the libraries, and within reason, they have the full Oxford social experience. What we're trying to do is to make Oxford both familiar and exciting to people who might not otherwise have applied here. And why we rate this scheme so highly is that the conversion rate is really good. In the last 2 years, almost 70% of the summer school attendees have applied to Oxford, and 41% of those who applied have been offered a place, which compares to about a 20% success rate for all applicants. Now, we've been fortunate in having philanthropic support from the Helsington Foundation to enable us to fund this activity up to now. But that support is coming to an end. We always knew that it would do, and we're committed to finding funds for it in the future, as we see this as a game changer for applicants from state school backgrounds. Now, I'm going to come on to some other aspects of funding just in my last stages of my remarks. We're proud in Oxford that we currently have the most generous support arrangements for the lowest income students of any UK university. We spend nearly 50% of the additional fee income that we receive from undergraduate fees on outreach, bursary and fee reduction arrangements for home EU students. Under our current arrangements, 1 in 6 students receives a fee reduction and around 1/4 receive a bursary. We currently provide fee reductions to students in household income groups up to £25,000 per annum and bursaries to students with household incomes up to just over £42,000 per annum. Our most generous provision goes to students in the 0 to 16,000 household income group. In 2012, circa 260 first-year Oxford UK undergraduates had a household income assessed by the Student Loans Company as £16,000 or under. So that's 1 in 10 of our undergraduates, slightly different, I think, from the 1 in 20 figure that was given as an aggregated number in John Jerram's report. The standard Oxford bursary and fee waiver offer sees those students paying fees of only £3,500 in their first year and £6,000 thereafter. They receive a bursary of £3,300 with an additional start-up bursary of £1,000 in their first year. Now that's our standard offer. Due to philanthropy, a very generous benefaction from Sir Michael Moritz and Miss Harriet Hyman, 100 of the lowest household income students receive support totalling £11,000 per annum through what we call the Moritz-Hyman Scholarship Programme. These students pay fees of only £3,500 per annum throughout their university career, and they receive a bursary of £5,500. Now, we identify recipients of these scholarships through using a combination of financial, contextual, and educational data to support the principle of prioritisation of the highest need. So these are people in the 0 to 16k group, and we identify them through a series of contextual data markers. I should also say that 2 other things go with this scheme. That in addition to getting this support, we make sure that every student who is a Moritz-Hyman scholar, who will be coming from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, has the opportunity to undertake a paid internship on at least one occasion in their long vacations while they're at Oxford. But we also ask something of them. We ask them to put in a certain amount of hours in volunteering during the time that they're at Oxford. And of our first year intake, virtually all of them have managed to complete what we've asked of them in terms of volunteering. And one of the great aspects of this is that volunteering can take the form of providing mentoring or school visits. And we see that as a very good way of, as it were, recycling what these students can tell to others. Now, I said earlier that we're still learning about the impact of the new funding regime, and that's so. The bursary and the fee reduction setup that we have was established in 2011, and it was very much influenced by research that we undertook with our then student community. It was also influenced by the direction of the government's National Scholarship Programme and by advice from OFFA. We're currently in the process of reconsidering the balance of our provision in preparation for our 2015-16 access agreement, and this is something that we have to discuss across our collegiate university. What I can say at this stage is that we remain very strongly committed to bursary provision for undergraduate students, and I'm happy to say more about that later if necessary. But basically, the reason for this is that being able to afford to live and to look after yourself at university without having to contemplate taking paid work in term is, we think, essential for students at a university with such intensive teaching provision as Oxford. So, along with targeted outreach and access work, targeted bursary provision is going to remain at the heart of our student support arrangements. Now, just finally, I've focused, because this summit is focusing on student support in terms of bursaries and access. But in concluding my remarks, I want to emphasise the point that in communicating with students on access and support, we know that it is vital to communicate to their teachers. So that's why at Oxford we incorporate within our access programme substantial work with teachers, locally, regionally and nationally. We know that the view that a teacher has of Oxford can be transformative to how a student perceives the place. And for that reason, we're proud to be the leading UK university supplier of graduates to Teach First. And we think that it says something about the experience that Oxford provides, that so many of our students want to go from university back into education to continue encouraging others to apply and to have the experience that they have had. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally, for giving us a... Thank you. Now, we've got about half an hour for questions to all or any of our panellists. So I'm going to take 3 questions to start things off. So we'll have one, and please say who you are, where you're from. We'll have one here to start, one there, and one there.
Hi, Penelope Griffin from the University of Nottingham. There seem to be differing views about the impact of financial support or bursaries, perhaps, I mean, within the country. I mean, Professor Ebden has expressed one view, Professor Mapstone has expressed another. US universities have talked about their commitment to need-based financial aid. I'm just wondering about, you know, what data are different people looking at? Can we help each other to look at the data to find out, well, what is helpful? Would it help if UK universities talked about need-based financial aid rather than bursaries?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just wondered if the panel had a view on... Oh, sorry. Mike Johnson from University of St Andrews. A view on where we're distributing the money in bursaries and scholarships. Often is the case we give them to the lowest income groupings, where we know that if your parents are a couple of clerical workers on around about 40 to 45,000 before tax, they're the ones who struggle to actually afford to meet that gap in funding. And there seems to be government support in loans and bursaries for the lower income families that can be topped up by quite generous £6,000–7,000, which actually comes to the salary of their parents. And John alluded to this earlier on, and I just wondered what are the thoughts of where we're actually putting this money to increase the mobility of some of these students.
Okay. And the third one there.
Hello, Tom Caulfield, the Student Room. We've talked quite a bit today about attracting bright students from hard-to-reach backgrounds. I was just wondering if I could get a sense from the panel as to your sense of how, if we're treating this as a market, how saturated is this market? Have we reached 20% of bright students from hard-to-reach backgrounds, or 80%? And if 20%, what's the big thing that's going to get it to 80%? Is it more money or innovation? And if the market is saturated, for want of a better term, do universities now feel like they're competing for these students? And if not, why not?
Okay, well, 3 very good questions to get us moving on that. Les, would you like to talk to those ones? I think we've got bursaries, we've got the middle income issue, and we've also got the saturation of the market.
Yes. Well, yes, it is interesting, isn't it, Penelope, that the different people have spoken differently about the importance of bursaries and scholarships. I've got to confess that when the £3,000 fees came in, I was the Vice-Chancellor, and I thought it was very important to give generous bursaries, and I was very proud that my university had the second most generous bursary offer in the country. And it fairly soon became clear it was making no impact whatsoever. In fact, it was very difficult to get students to claim their bursary. It was making no difference to application numbers, and I'd also hoped it would make a difference to retention, and it didn't seem to be making very much difference to retention either. It's now interesting that we now have national research, which I think is very strong now, that under £3,000 fees, that bursaries and scholarships did not make a difference to students applying to university, or which university they applied to. I think we're still refining it, but the early indications of the research we're doing at Offer at the moment is that bursaries have made little difference to retention under the £3,000. Now, you may argue under 9,000 they will make a bigger difference, and it is remarkable that we know that the government student support, the grant system, does make a big difference, particularly from low-income groups, as to whether people go or not. Maybe the difference is the sense that a grant is guaranteed. If you meet certain criteria, then you will get that government grant, whereas the scholarships and bursaries have never been so clearly guaranteed. And people, it's a generation, of course, of people who receive letters through the post every day and texts on their mobile phones telling them they've won the most amazing lottery prizes. And all they've got to do is claim them. Maybe they put our scholarships and bursaries in the same area. It does seem to be counterintuitive, but the evidence that we have at offer is strongly that they don't make a difference in decisions that people make, and that's why we're urging people to use that money more effectively in outreach programs. Mike, I take the point, but clearly with limited resources, then it's very important to be targeting. And I think in England, at least, universities choose their own target groups and who they are going to target. And the evidence, I think, is quite strongly that it's the lowest two quintiles which are very important to target with the limited resources that we have. Tom, have we reached saturation? Actually, we're nowhere near saturation. I showed a slide there showing less than 1 in 5 students from the most disadvantaged fifth of the population going to university, compared to 50% or more in other quintiles. So there's a massive distance to move, unless you believe that there's a significant difference in potential between those different quintiles. If you believe that your parents' income determines your intelligence, then maybe you could argue. But if you look at those figures that I presented, we're absolutely nowhere near saturation. But where we are, of course, people are in strong competition, is when you have students who have done particularly well from those disadvantaged backgrounds, because we know that disadvantage is there in schools. It is reflected in the outcomes of examinations, and quite frankly, an AAB or an ABB student, if you know the jargon, high achieving students who are off quota students are very precious students if they come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and people do compete very hard to get them.
Thank you. Michael, you mentioned in your remarks the idea that maybe we should be increasing the fees for some and moving towards needs blind. I mean, maybe sort of say a little of that in the context of answering the questions.
Yes, I was going to, I'm not on top of the sort of details of the UK arrangements in the way that Les has just described, so I was just going to pick out 2 or 3 points, including that one. One is I just want to repeat what I pick up Penelope's point, that however good you get financial support, and as Les says, there's complexities in the data, thinking about the social and the academic support that go with them and the combinations is a really important part of this. So I just want to add that to that answer. I had a great conversation with Alistair MacDonald, who I know you know, Conor, from Morpeth, who has done a wonderful job of improving his school in over a 15-20 year period in the east of London. And students now are regularly getting into university in a way that never happened before, but quite often they come back to him 6 months or a year into the university and say, we're finding not the financial side of it, but the social and academic side of it really hard, because the school has worked hard to get those students and families up to that place, and that needs to be picked up and built on. So I think that just needs to, I know this is about financial support, but thinking about the combination seems to me really important. I think one of the things about the fee regime now coming into place in England is, and we need to keep remembering, and it relates to, let's compare the 3,000 and the 9,000, but the big change is you don't pay anything until you're earning 21,000. That is a very big difference, and it's a big step forward potentially for equity, which is why I think applications are up this year after the first year, when people, there was a lot of noise in the public information, but now that it's clear, that is actually a big step forward. And if you reduce the fee, you won't benefit the students that are at the heart of your social mobility campaign here in the Sutton Trust. You will if you can find ways of providing the academic, social and financial support in the way that MIT is doing, because it's been building its endowment for years and years and years. And we need to get into that kind of thinking. That would be a much better use of government. Plus, actually, I don't know if the government has a plan for a major privatisation in the near future, but a capital sum could get that started in a way that would take it out of the sort of annual revenue. You could really begin, and there's an argument about whether I'm not saying you'd have to be one big national fund, but helping universities get going in that area would be a big step forward for social mobility.
Sally, on that point, I mean, do you think that moving to some sort of a needs-blind basis with differential fees like that, which of course was what the whole move was supposed to be about, differential fees, do you think that would be something that Oxford would want to see?
I think we'd be very interested in seeing the potential for a move to variable fees, yes, but I think there are a couple of things that go with that. One is that price should never be an impediment to talent, essentially, and that, if people are good enough, they've got to be able to get in. And the other is that when you're looking at the repayment mechanism, you're looking very hard at income contingent measures. I wonder if I could just go back to the bursaries point. Is that okay? Because I was very grateful for the question. Because I think there's a sort of creative tension here between, when we think about bursaries, between how Offer looks at this, understandably, from the point of view of what is going to increase access, and from the perspective that universities have in terms of how they feel their students are going to be looked after while they're on course. And I think, to my mind, this actually touches on some quite interesting questions about what constitutes social mobility that Vince Cable raised with us this morning. About a year ago, we had the pleasure of a visit from Les to Oxford, and he met some of our students, and this question of bursaries came up. We asked Les if Arthur was still of the view that bursaries weren't a tremendous, as it were, impetus necessarily for access and social mobility, and Les expressed the views that you've heard. And our students said that they felt very strongly, particularly those who came from what you might call disadvantaged backgrounds, that bursaries actually made a really big difference to that sense of being at university and, if you like, levelling up and having the kind of experience that, as it were, everybody can get at university when you're not having to worry all the time about whether you can afford things. And there was one student who we all held our breath slightly, although we didn't think he was going to say anything too terrible, but said to Les, it was great because I had the opportunity to go, and you feared that he might be going to say beagling or deer stalking or something of that sort. But what he actually referred to was ice skating. And he was just saying, when I want to kind of chill with my friends, I know that I've got a bursary that enables me not just to kind of get books and stuff, but to do the normal things that are actually, when you're at university and you're trying to kind of level out the social groups, it's really important that students feel that they've got that kind of support. And that's one of the reasons why we esteem bursaries so much, because we think they actually do play a role in kind of levelling off the differences between certain social groups and making people feel really positively part of a cohort.
Thanks, Sally. Stuart, I'm particularly interested in the view that you have from MIT on the middle income, if you like, the squeeze middle, because the sort of support you've got goes up quite a bit further, I suppose, than would be the case here. Maybe you could say a little about that as well as the other.
Yes, absolutely. Because that is a challenge for us, and we basically price our education to the extent that we believe our families are able to pay for our education, which is different from whether the families think they are willing to pay for our education. And for students in the low-income groups, we are pretty much well aligned because we give them enough aid that they're paying basically nothing other than what the student can contribute through loans, which, as we've talked about, or I mentioned earlier, that we think are appropriate, and working while they're on campus, which also we see as an appropriate thing for students to be doing. The middle income group is more challenge, and one of the questions that come up a lot is this notion of fairness, as to, particularly for middle income families, as to whether we're asking them to pay more than they feel that they can afford. Because we look at families, we look at their histories as to how much they have saved to be able to enroll, because we expect families to pay for their education from past savings, current income, and future income. right? So it's not all having to come out of their current income. And families have very different patterns of having saved their prior income. And again, it's where a lot of education comes in. We do a lot of education for in our communities for parents and families of younger children so that they understand what is going to happen once their kids get to be college age and what they have to have done. Because it is a big commitment on families. But I don't have the rosiest answer, other than I know that I do know at the end of the day what we ask families to pay. They do wind up paying and are able to do just fine at it. But there's a lot of conversation and communication that has to occur. If I can make, and I should also point out that we're offering scholarship money to families that earn $150,000, $200,000 a year. We're giving aid to those families. Again, our price is much higher, so that we need to do that. I want to make one other point around this notion of fairness that I mentioned, because we have high price and high aid, and so the questions of fairness come up. The families that are able to pay very high tuitions wonder, is this fair for them? And we try to remind them that even those families that are paying our full price are not actually paying our full cost. And we've figured out that per student, the educational costs are double what our full sticker price is of tuition. And so we communicate that very heavily, that even those families that are paying full price are still being subsidized by our institution. And that's a very important point for us from a communication point of view, because this notion of fairness, what is fair? I mean, I don't want to get into the whole philosophical discussion over this, but is everybody paying the same fair, or is everybody paying what they can pay fair? There are many different, you might get different views on that, and certainly depending on where you sit, you might have a different perspective on that.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. We'll take another 3 questions, if we can see. Tessa, one, Tessa? We've got 2 more as well. Line up. Be shy. One over there. Tessa, if you'd like to go ahead, yeah.
Okay,
and then
thank you.
One behind there, yeah. Okay.
Tessa Stone from Brightside Trust. This is picking up on Michael's point about financial, social and academic support being an absolutely critical triumvirate, and Les's focus that we anticipate that we'll see in the national strategy on student life cycle. Les, when you and I shared a platform last week, your comments about the student life cycle dominated the rest of the day's discussion, and there was a lot of talk amongst universities about how ready they were or not to take on the student life cycle element of the support that's needed. And when I did a straw poll of the 50 or so universities in the room, only 6 felt that their universities understood the problems of differential outcomes for different groups of students and were beginning to tackle that in a serious way. In the absence of additional funds for this broad package that universities have to focus on, how are we going to encourage universities to put money where money will be needed to support current undergraduates in the way that they've been putting money into outreach and widening participation?
Thank you, Tessa. I think Charles is next up. Charles over there, yep.
Thank you. Charles Ritchie, Department of Business Innovation and Skills. I think it's mainly a question for Stuart, and it's just around the complexity of the student finance situation in the States. I mean, I've recently had to try and do some investigation to find out, what the American system was. And I think my overriding feeling was it is just incredibly complicated, and each institution being different. And I just wondered about your reflections on that, in terms of being a barrier to sort of recruiting disadvantaged students. Because I think in this country, it is a more simple system, and there's certainly more uniformity across. But even the UK system, I think students have difficulty with, and particularly sort of picking up on things like bursaries. So reflections on that.
And we had one more, I think, over here. Alex.
Yes, hi, I'm Deborah Davis from the Wolfson Foundation. I'd like to put a question to Sally Mapstone on postgraduate bursaries. I'm just wondering whether you think they should be targeted specifically to postgraduate students whose families have low income or who have any form of deprivation in their educational background.
Thank you. And there was one other, I think, just there, if we can take that as well. Yep. Okay.
It's Richard, a friend. It's really for Les Ebden. On what criteria will you or should we judge the ultimate success of the offer system?
Well, that's a short one. Right, shall we take the individual ones first? I think we had one on complexity for you, Stuart. If you want to go on that for Charles's one.
Yes. So complexity is, I think, is the biggest barrier now. As I mentioned, there is a significant information gap. Low-income students whose parents have not been to college, do not understand the system, and are unable, therefore, to advise their students about this, opt out because they see the sticker price of our university system, and they, particularly the more selective schools, for whom it would ultimately be cheaper. I think, and the system here in the UK is simpler, and I think you pay for simplicity. So our complex system directs funds to those who need it more. So it's more efficient. So we are not giving aid to families who don't need it. The simplest system of all would be just to make higher education free. We can't afford to do that, but that would be the simplest. And it would also be the least efficient because you'd be giving funds to those who don't need the funds. And so the US system has taken that to the absurd extreme and made it so complex, but maybe most efficient, right? Because it's directing the funds to those who need it the most. Coming up with some kind of balance is a challenge, and the diversity focused on funding, or at least diversity and complexity in higher education, is not just limited to funding also. I mean, our entire system is diverse and complex for students to try to figure out. Ask a student what is the best fit institution for you to attend. That is a bewildering choice as well, because there's so many differences amongst universities. And again, I think there is strength in that diversity, but what's required is good information. So I don't think it's ideal because we need that information. There's still an information gap, but if we can solve some of those informational gaps, I think the complex system ultimately is a better one.
Okay. Sally, postgraduate bursaries. And whether they should be targeted.
Thank you for what I think is a really important question. Should postgraduate bursaries be targeted? We're very conscious that at Oxford we have a sort of slightly schizoid set of arrangements in that our undergraduate bursary provision is targeted on the basis of disadvantage, and our graduate scholarship provision is almost entirely on the basis of academic merit. So we're aware of that dichotomy. But there are reasons for this, and one of them is that it's much easier, particularly with home students, to get information about disadvantage at undergraduate level. And we are very reliant on the information that we get on household income from the Student Loans Company, and on a number of other factors that we get via the UCAS system. Now, for graduate students, it's not as straightforward as that. You can't transpose the Student Loan Company material because you don't have it. It's more difficult to use postcode evidence in relation to graduates because they won't, where they're living won't necessarily tell you particularly about that much about their actual background. So we're conscious of this, but we're also conscious, as I said earlier, that there is a really significant graduate access issue, given that there is so little in the way of Research Council funding, in particular for PGT students. So we have decided to do something about this. We hope that we will be able to take an initiative in this direction. And what we decided to do was to respond to, we're keeping our fingers crossed here, was to respond to the HEFGE postgraduate Graduate Student Support Initiative, by bidding for funds, which we would put a matching element into, to enable us to establish a stream within our graduate match funding arrangements, which would speak to graduate disadvantage. And one of the things that we're putting into that scheme is a research project to enable us more effectively to identify disadvantage, to find, as it were, the right sets of criteria and questions that we can put to prospective students so that we can seek to identify and plot disadvantage better. So I think the answer is yes, we would very much want to do that. We're conscious that in the sector as a whole, there are challenges in being able to do it, but we're hoping that we're going to be able to run a pilot project which will enable us to get some more information there and build on it.
Thank you, Sally. Les, do you want to tell me what constitutes success for you?
Yes. Success will be when we see that family background, the finances of the household from which a student comes, ethnicity, all those characteristics which at the moment determine whether you go to university and which university no longer apply.
That's succinct, thank you. Michael, would you like to pick up Tessa's question on the student life cycle and how we deal?
Yes, can I just mention, in the previous round of questions, Tom asked about whether we were reaching the maximum of bright students. I just want to, I forgot to respond. I just want to say, like Les, I don't think we're anywhere near that, not least because bright itself is not a limited category. Intelligence is learnable, it's not inherited and fixed, and if the schools get better, there will be many, many more students who we would now term bright, or Americans would term smart. And it's a big flaw in Western societies that we think of bright and smart as kind of fixed categories. And those categories will change. So quite apart from the social things that Les mentioned, there's a lot more potential, a long way to go there.
Do you think you can attract by spending more money, or do you think it could be clever? We are all running the world. Could we make it a completely level playing field?
Maybe in some long distant future, but the most important thing we could do on that is to improve the quality of our schools. That's not to say they haven't improved a lot, but the consistency and quality of our schools would be the biggest single thing we could do right, including, by the way, preschool. I've just been re-looking at some research that Conor and I commissioned years and years ago called the EPI, the early preschool and primary, and those kids are now 13, and you see the impact, not just of preschool education, done by people at Oxford actually, but now Oxford anyway, and then but also the type of preschool that made a difference, and getting those things right all the way through would make a massive difference to the category we described as bright. So it would cost some money, but it's also about getting the policy right. The second thing I just want to mention in passing, I was at MIT not a few months ago, and this came back to me while I was listening to you, Stuart. I went to the Media Lab, which is a wonderful thing where they're trying to invent the future. One of the things they had in there's some weird and wonderful things. One of them is a wallet that knows how much money you've got in your bank account. So just after payday, it opens really easily. And at the end of the month, it's really hard to open it. I just think somehow that seems relevant in this debate, both for students and potentially civil servants and others. But on Tessa's question, yes, look, I thinking about the three angles of the triangle I mentioned, academic, social, and financial, is important. And I just want to, I mean, we could debate that a lot, but I just want to throw in another thought here, which is that I don't think universities are using their alumni very imaginatively. So we quote in An Avalanche is Coming the letter from Rick Levine, the outgoing president of Yale, to alumni. He says he's leaving after a wonderful 20 years, and then he lists his achievement. Every one of them is a building. He never says we had these many Nobel Prizes, these many life-changing pieces of research, these fantastic winners of all the different prizes in different academic areas. He just talks about buildings, and it's the wrong. I mean, and he was a successful president, certainly. It's the wrong way to think about, or it's not the only way to think about alumni. And in some of these academic and social and employability issues, the alumni, if tapped, would be great as mentors, advisors on employment tracks. And they'd probably love to be asked, but they never get asked.
Can I just say I've got an article in Research Fortnightly on exactly that theme this week.
Oh, good for you.
Well plugged, Tessa. I've got a couple of the panel who want to just come back on other points. Stuart, you wanted to say something briefly about
very
saturation?
briefly about saturation, which I don't think we are, certainly in the U.S., saturated either. But one constraint we have, or challenge to that, is the fact that we have about 4,500 undergraduate students at MIT, and that's been true for the last number of decades. And if we really want to think about opening access, we have to educate more students. And but it's hard to do that the way our current model is set up, because as Sally talked about, close contact with faculty is very important. So how do we do that? And so we believe that there are ways to do that using technology in the future. We haven't figured out what those are yet, but I think if we really want to make a bigger dent in access, we have to have more seats. There have to be more places for students to go. We open that up, open the pipeline up at this end, not just at that end, but at this end, there'll be more flow.
I don't want to. I think this question of what combinations of online and face-to-face teaching are likely to be both enable more access and be of high quality and lower the cost is really where the debate should go.
Yes.
And Les, you wanted to sort of come back on Tessa's point, I think.
Well, Tessa asked me what would encourage universities to put more money into these activities. In fact, universities have got a very strong vested interest in achieving success in these areas. I mean, it is very obvious in terms of retention and student success. My governors were quick to point out to me at the University of Bedfordshire, where I was Vice-Chancellor, that under the new system, every student that we lost that didn't complete, that was a loss of £9,000 per student per year. So if they left at the end of the first year without getting a degree, that was a personal tragedy for them. But you could begin to calculate the cost it was to the university and the value of making the investment in doing the kind of things that Michael's talked about in terms of making students fit in and feel they belong and were part of the university. We know some of the things that we should be doing. We know it costs money, but actually we know that it's well worth making that investment in universities that are challenged in that particular area. Going back, obviously, to other universities, why should universities engage in that kind of outreach activity when, you know, their problem is that they've got so many students, they're turning them away and have to be highly selective. I think it's interesting that in the US, this is without dispute, that if you want to be a world-class university, if you want to be regarded as academically successful, if you want to give the best possible experience to your students, then you have to have a diversity in your student body, and only then will you produce the best of education, only then will you produce excellence. There's a strong national argument that says that if we are going to be a competitive nation in future, we have to identify the potential in our population wherever it is and give them access and the greatest opportunity for student success. They're very strong vested interests for universities. It doesn't really need me coming along with a big stick, but you know, that in some ways that's the role of a regulator, is because the general population wants to be reassured that the government is doing something about this. They can see that it's important, and therefore that the government is doing something about it. The way that is most successful, in my opinion, working with the universities is working with the grain, the independence and creativity of universities to identify ways of reaching out to students, ways of achieving our aims here is tremendous, and it's harnessing that creativity and that smart thinking that is the way for success, I think.
Well, on that note, Les, I'm afraid our time's up. I'm sure we'd want to express our gratitude to all of our panellists for some great insights and some great speeches this afternoon.